Hi, and welcome back to It's
Hello.
Not Rocket Science 5 Questions Over Coffee. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by Jackie Naughten. Now, they always say if you want to improve, if you want to get better in your business, you should employ people who are better than you. And that's how I feel about my guest today. I am really delighted to be having a conversation with Jackie, who has a far more impressive portfolio of businesses and interests than I have met. And so I'm really, really delighted, Jackie, you found time in your diary to come and join us for a few minutes. Jackie is what they call the unretirement speaker. She revealed facts and the reality about retirement in the 2020s for the boomers and how to get to your 100-year lifespan. She mentors and supports entrepreneurs who need to pivot and grow. And if she hasn't got enough going on, she's also the MD of a business whose mission is to change the narrative around the 50 plus woman to become the invisible, increasingly disappear at that age. And she's there to change that. And that therefore means that what is throughout all of her career, what throughout all of her passion is that of change, changing individuals, changing businesses. The need for change, managing change and working out what is required is absolutely one of the critical bits of business that we need in the world today. So, Jackie, delighted you've found time to come and spend a few minutes with us. Thank you so much for being on It's Not Rocket Science 5 Questions Over Coffee.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart. I hope it isn't rocket science. I hope it's not complicated as that.
No, nothing is as complicated as that. Look, Jackie, let's start. You talk about being an unretirement speaker. You talk about leading Noon. Tell us, what is it? Who is it that you're trying to help? I guess it's obvious, but who is it you're trying to help to understand these changes that you're bringing to the world?
Well, I think like most things in life, when you have any, successful people across all sorts of businesses and disciplines, and they tell their life story, usually things happen because of what's happened in their lives, isn't it?
Mm,
So you tend to look at yourself and think, well, this has happened to me. I'm sure it must be happening to other people. So in the case of unretirement, I'm in my 60s now. And as I've approached that time, and it sort of comes upon you, you're bumbling along in your 40s, and the next thing you think, oh my goodness, how did I get here? And everybody starts saying, oh, so great. So you're going to retire now. And I'm like, no, I don't want to retire. What am I going to do? And so I started to investigate this whole idea about not retiring, because when I really thought about it for myself, I thought, because retirement sounds like giving up, finishing, stopping. It feels like the end of life. And I didn't feel like that at all. And I think, particularly for women, when we've had a lot of time caring responsibilities, juggling careers, suddenly as you get to your 60s, you actually have the time that you've always wanted to do things. So I started to investigate this whole issue of unretirement, which I came up with. And then I found that actually exists out there, and people are talking about unretirement, which is really, it's actually been coined by people who are actually returning to the workforce. So they've retired and then they've spent a couple of years in retirement, had a couple of cruises, done an extension, and then they're bored and they've come back. Because the truth of the matter is that for we boomers, and let's be honest, the boomers, we've been quite a pioneering generation. We are now, this is the final frontier for us, pioneering this move into older age. And typically, as boomers, we're not doing it like it's been done before. So we question it, we're having a different approach to it, we have a different lived experience in our lives. I mean, certainly from the female point of view, a lot of us have had careers and brought up families, which didn't happen 50, 100 years ago. So we're a pioneering generation, and it's all changing. And we can see the rock stars are still rocking, the screenwriters are still writing, the actors are still acting well into their 80s and 90s. So it's all changing. And so it's against that backdrop that I speak about on retirement.
And I think that's a really interesting point, Jackie, because one of the things you just sort of talked about there is it's the experience that you bring. The fact of the matter is that the people who have retire often know better than anybody coming through all those things that do work and don't work, and how to make
Mm.
that change the most practical, the most effective as they can be. And it's often that experience that we lose when people just sort of go off and do the
I
cruises
mean,
and
and it's not
spend
for
time at
everybody.
home.
some people are very happily retired, and particularly perhaps if you've been in a more manual occupation. Typically you would have been working perhaps since you were 16. You can't physically do the job, be a roofer anymore or whatever. And some many people are very happy to retire and focus on family and different things. But there's an awful lot of us who don't want to do that, and there's an awful lot of people who can't do that because the state pension age is going up, and let's be honest, not many of us can live on that state pension. It's sort of more of a, about £1,000 a month. If you've got 25 years to live in retirement, £1,000 a month isn't going to give you a very exciting, stimulating life. So, that's the facts of the matter. So, we've seen it for some time that our pensioners are going back into the workforce to supplement their income. Um, Places like B&Q, have taken on older people with all their experience, etc. But it's actually a much bigger issue now, and we're going to have by I think 2040 about 50% of the workforce is going to be over 50.
Mm, mm.
Um, and so there's a couple of things going on. First of all, there's a thing for people personally, what they want to do and achieve. And secondly, there's the issue for companies who are seeing a shrinking workforce because the birth rate's dropping, and they're suddenly waking up to the fact they might need older people. But meanwhile, what we know is 50 plus people are finding it incredibly difficult to get back into the workforce because there is a generational a generational ageism going on, which is the last frontier of sort of equality in the workplace, which is something that we at Noon, with my other hat on, are working on. So, my unretirement interest and speaking about unretirement kind of has a very nice crossover with the work I do at Noon, which is all about the 50 plus women who are very keen to get back to work and think about what they're going to do as they pivot in the midlife.
And I'm so glad you brought noon in, because I was about to ask, of course, what is noon, and so therefore, let's move on to sort of what it is. Therefore, then that you've seen people who are trying to sort of cope with this on retirement. You've mentioned a couple of times people who've retired and it's not for them, so they've gone back to work. What is it that you are trying to do to help them with that transition? How do you help people to understand whether or not retirement is right for them?
Well, I think what we have to think about is very simple: is what gets you out of bed in the morning. What gets you out of bed in the morning, and what doesn't get me out of bed in the morning is just thinking, oh, I'm going to see some friends for lunch, and I'll maybe go to the gym later. I mean, I'm not saying that's not nice to do, but it's lacking a sort of purpose, a sort of satisfaction. That's what I've found, because I did have a period of time when I had cancer, and that enforced me to have a year off. And while you're not very well, obviously, was so frustrated because I couldn't do anything. I hadn't got any point. I couldn't work and all these things. And so I'm just somebody, and there's lots of us around who just like working. I mean, lots of people work in volunteer positions because they just want to have a purpose. And what we know, I think it's Sigmund Freud who said, there's two main things in life out of all of this is love and work, which is
Mm,
really purpose and human connection. And
mm.
that's what working can give you. And that's what we as humans, on the whole, keeps us going. So, when I say work, it doesn't necessarily have to be financially rewarding work. It could be all sorts of things, but it's finding purpose. And I think that's where people quite often need help because, as we all know, when we try and write about ourselves or market ourselves, it's very difficult doing that yourself. It's much more helpful if you do it with somebody else who can interpret how you are. And that's where coaching or mentoring comes in because I can work with people and they maybe, let's say they've been an accountant for 20, 30 years. All they can think about is like, well, I'm very good with numbers. I can do accountancy, but I don't want to do it anymore. And it's very difficult for them to think, what are the other possibilities? So what I'm very good at is thinking creatively with people about the other skills and strengths that they might have that could take them in a different direction.
Takes us in so many directions, actually, because I think you're absolutely right. The meaningful connections is hugely important. I think biologists are now beginning to discuss, or you hear in the media that loneliness can be the equivalent of smoking
Yes,
15
yes,
cigarettes a day, and
yes,
having
exactly.
those meaningful connections can extend your lifespan.
I mean, I have to say, I have looked into an article about that. It's a
Great.
slightly, typically, as you can imagine, typically a sort of convoluted piece of data when you get underneath it because it's not that simple. But loneliness is an epidemic, and as we live longer, I mean, I'm widowed myself. As we live longer, the divorce rate, a lot of people are getting divorced in their 50s and 60s because they're thinking if they're living till they're 85 and they're in an unsatisfactory relationship, they're actually getting divorced in their 60s, which is another reason why people often need to work, because the financial pots got smaller, etc., etc. And also for women who are divorced and on their own, typically men tend to find another partner, women perhaps not. They want to go to work and they might not have worked for 10, 15 years. And so, and they have no idea, jobs have changed, the workplace has changed tremendously. And so it's a little bit scary for people when they're older to go back into, but they're quite keen to have that connection and to have some purpose.
So, so Jackie, if we now look at how people can get in contact with you, I think you've given us um,
Mm,
your LinkedIn, and the Noon, which is the
mm.
organisation. Are there things that they'll find there that could be helping them to understand this transition that you're talking to people about?
Well, certainly at Noon, we have a lot of resources on there. We have a lot of interviews. We cover divorce, bereavement, cancer, job searching, all of those sorts of things. And there's lots of uplifting stories about, because what we learn from in life is stories. And it's always
Mm,
interesting to hear
mm,
somebody else's story. And
yeah.
particularly if you're going through a tough time in your life. So for myself, I've got my story was my husband was diagnosed with a terminal illness when I was 42, and I
Mm,
had to pivot. I had to change everything in my life. My life literally went up in the air, and I had to reinvent myself. I had to give up my corporate job. I went out into the world and became a consultant just based on networking, really, without any plan or thought. And so I've learned to market myself. I learned that I had skills I didn't realize I had. And this is, I think, the point of coaching, etc., where you actually got skills you don't realize you have, because you think all you can do is add up numbers, if, do a balance sheet in accountancy. But actually, you've got loads of other skills as well. And actually, these other skills into modern workplace are even more important, the softer skills, communicating, leading, problem solving, these sorts of skills, which you can apply to all sorts of things. So, if you go to Noon, you can find out about the midlife women. If you just come to my LinkedIn and connect with me, then I'm more than happy to. I get all sorts of people who I meet day to day and for various speaking engagements approaching me saying, "Can you help with this? Can you help with that?" Because I've also worked with a lot of entrepreneurs, and it's whether it's a business or a person, quite often a business falters and stutters, and it might need to be reinvented, or it might need to take a different turn. And again, when you're the founder and the owner, it's quite difficult working that out. You need
yeah.
someone from
Yes.
outside to help you work that through.
Yes. Jackie, is there a book or course that really sort of helped you to understand how the unretirement world is beginning to become the new work?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, we are shortly going to be running courses at Noon about this. We're working on those at the moment. I've got a book here which I came across called Designing Your Life, and I came across this about 10 years ago. I mean, that's an old version there, and it was written by two guys in I think it's Stanford University in America, Bill Burnett and Dave Evans, and it absolutely fascinated me because I'm a brand person, so because my background is retail and consumer brands. And when you talk about brands, you're talking about brands have a sort of personality and they have values, etc. And what this book did, it actually looked at people as if they were brands, and so it really resonated with me, because actually these days people, there's lots of chat about, people talk about their personal brand, and your personal brand is just how you present to the world and what your values are and what you can, how you can help people with. And so I would say designing your life was all about looking at people that felt they were a square peg in a round hole, and how they thought, just because they were interested, for example, one of the founders, the writers here, I mean, he was always, as a little boy, interested in marine biology. He became a marine biologist. And when he was about 35, he suddenly thought, I'm just not really that interested in this. I don't know why I've done this, and he was actually interested in something completely, something completely different. And quite honest, I mean, when I was at school, I was good at languages. So they said I should work in the Foreign Office. I would have been absolutely useless as a civil servant because those are the sort of boxes, we get put in boxes. And I still feel even today, the recruitment industry puts us in boxes, whereas actually people often have lots of other sides to them. So I would very much recommend that. And I would also recommend just going if you're interested to pursue um, uh, reviewing your opportunities in life, is to find a coach or a mentor. There's lots of TED Talks, for example, are an absolutely fantastic
Mm,
resource, which is all about telling stories about how
mhm.
people have embraced change and changed things, and they're very inspirational. Yeah, that would be what I would say. Go out. Main thing is go out into the world and connect with people. I think you learn a lot by
I
chatting to other people.
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with more. Listen, Jackie, I kept you talking for about the last 15, 20 minutes, asking you all sorts of silly questions, but there must be one question that you're thinking, well, I wish he would get on to this subject. So this is my opportunity to get you to say, what is the question that you would like me to have asked? Well, obviously, then when I've got you to ask the question, you better answer it. So what's that question you would like me to have asked?
Um, I suppose the question I would like you to have asked, or that I think is a good question to ask anybody, what has been the biggest, what has made the biggest impact in your life, to bring you to where you are today, today.
That's a very good question. So what has been that biggest impact?
Well, I think the biggest impact is really goes back to that story I just told of when my husband was diagnosed with an illness, which is that you never know what's around the corner.
Mm, mm.
So, I always say my big piece of advice to my kids and to anybody who gets in a bit of a twiddle and a twaddle with things is to say, have a plan. The plan can change.
Yeah,
Because people get, particularly when they're in a situation, and as I sort of mentioned, a lot of what I do is about because I do so many things and I've worked, I'm in my fourth or fifth career now. But what's a common thread through all of that? It's about change and pivoting, either pivoting, responding to outside influences, because something, you've got divorced, you've got cancer, whatever happened, you've got a sick child and you have to change and rethink what you're doing, or because you want something different, you want to be re-energized and do something different. So I think the most important thing is to realize that you can't, that life won't be as you plan. Have a plan, the plan can change, and go out and connect. People are the biggest resource that's free out there that you can connect with. And just, you might, I mean, we're probably, Stuart, natural connectors. We're doing this sort of stuff. We are sort of probably, people would, I'm certainly myself an extrovert. It's not easy for everybody. Not everybody's like that, but certainly if you're not somebody, and a lot of people think, oh, networking, oh, that's a load of old, but actually, whether you want to call it connecting or networking, connecting, meeting people, for me, your fellow humans are your biggest resource if you want to make change. And you can't do any, and it's free, to a certain extent. It might cost you a cup of coffee or some of your time, but I've never had a wasted meeting with anybody in my life. And you always learn something. So that's what I would really encourage people to do. I don't think people realize how much that can impact your life.
I think that's a brilliant thing to say, and certainly something that I'm passing on to a number of the. I do some work with some students, and I do with them,
Mm,
um, and I'd give them something very similar, which is, if someone suggests a meeting, take the meeting. You don't know what's going to
yes.
happen. You
Mm,
might look at it and think, well, that would be a waste of my time, but you have
yeah.
no idea where it's going, who they might meet, who
No,
they might
and you
introduce you to.
always,
You never
always
know.
always learn something. And I've learned, probably when I was younger, I was a bit more judgmental, and I've really, really learned. And that's the one thing about older age, you get a bit more wisdom, and you have hindsight. And I would say, I don't think I've ever had a wasted meeting, because even if you don't get the outcome from the meeting that you wanted, you make a connection. And, invariably, I mean, how many times do you have conversations with people and it's the 6 degrees of separation?
Yeah.
You've always somebody you've got in common somewhere. I find it quite amazing. And having been on this planet now for such a long time, and recently gone back out into the world of entrepreneurs and founders. I've just been talking to somebody who has a similar background to me in corporate. I've done corporate finance and private equity. And of course, we have, there's all these people we have in common. It just never ceases to fascinate me. And I think your point you make about your students, obviously the younger generation growing up in a different digital time.
Yeah.
And I just worry for that generation sometimes. Do they realize, because they do everything on technology, maybe even on Zoom? I still would rather, I mean, this is lovely to do this, but it's wonderful to meet people in person. It is a different experience. And I think it's really important that young people understand the power of connection, not just on a WhatsApp and through, all this. My daughters won't even take phone calls. They don't like talking on the phone. It's got to be all this. So, I do worry for the younger generation, and I think it's really important that we make sure that they do understand the power of connection.
I wonder if we could have another 2.5 hours on that subject. So I better close us down before we do, because I know that's something that I worry a lot about
Yes,
working
yes.
with
I think
young.
well, I think all of us boomers. I mean, and my daughters call me that's so boomer, because I've got a desk covered in paper because I write notes with a pen, and they get, oh, look, that's such a. And she took a picture of it and said that's such a boomer desk because I've got paper and pens on it, and they don't have anything.
I'm
So
sure.
I think us boomers are very worried about the young. They're all doing fantastically well, but there are just certain aspects that you do worry.
I am very concerned at the moment about a number of people that I meet that don't. When I say to them, "Have you chatted to them about that?" They go, "Oh, yes, yes," and I go, "Well, what did they say?" And they say, "Well, they didn't say anything because we did it over text." And my immediate response is, "Never ever managed to resolve any dispute,
No, no.
resolution, any negotiation. Never went well when you were doing emails and texts. They always
Also,
needed
if
somebody."
you put the comma in the wrong place, it's completely a different statement. I have this with my best friend all the time. She doesn't pay attention when she's reading, and you can just so misinterpret the text. It just doesn't. Well, certainly not for business. No, not at all.
I'm going to bring this to an end before we alienate half of the young people that I've persuaded to listen to this podcast because they need to. Jackie, it's been an absolute joy to spend time with you. I really appreciate you making a few minutes to speak with us. I'm just going to put on the screen now the link to our newsletter. Now, if you want to get onto the mailing list, where you will get an email from me which actually says who's coming up to talk to us on these LinkedIn lives and podcasts, so that you get notification and you can actually think about whether or not you want to link with them or spend any time thinking about questions you'd like to put them. Go to this URL, which is on the screen at the moment, https:// link.thecompleteapproach.co.uk/newsletter. That's link.thecompleteapproach.co.uk/newsletter. And also, you will then get subscribed to the podcast when it gets released as a second bite of the cherry, when you can listen to all of this again and rewind and listen to it as many times as you want, because I think some of the stuff that Jackie has given us today are absolute nuggets of information. They're really applicable to a number of the audience. Jackie, thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us. Really appreciate you spending.
My pleasure. And sort of just on the point about the younger generation, I do work with a lot of, because I have young children myself. I work with a lot of young people who are often stuck in their 20s as to what they're going to do. So I'm more than happy to talk to anybody about, any young people out there who are stuck and not sure which way to go. More than happy to have conversation.
Jackie, I know so many people who would take you up on that. I'm going to point you in your direction. Thank you so much for spending some time. I know how valuable your time is, because when you've just talked about as much as you're doing, you must try and cram in as much as you can. So thank you for a few minutes of your time. I really appreciate you being with us.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Stuart. It's been a pleasure.